Our nation is caught within a number of grave problems at the same time. This week in cities all across America, the pain of racial injustice has been compounded by violent riots that have drowned out peaceful protests and hurt innocent people. Millions of working families continue to face the historic economic fallout from the coronavirus pandemic, including unemployment levels not seen in decades. And lest we forget, Madam President, the actual pandemic itself is still with us. The virus continues to claim hundreds of American lives every day, challenge healthcare professionals, and paralyze schools, universities, and employers that are eager to reopen. Of course, there's also the important business we would have needed to address even before the pandemic. So for all of these reasons and more, while the Democratic House of Representatives may be absent, with no plans to return for weeks and weeks, the U.S. Senate is here and working for the American people. This week, we're filling more critical vacancies throughout our government. Yesterday, we confirmed the Special Inspector General for the pandemic response. This is a brand new position born of immediate necessity and goals shared by members of both parties. And yet, though our Democratic colleagues said for weeks that CARES Act oversight was a top priority, our colleagues chose to delay the nomination as long as possible. When the rubber met the road, yet again, picking small fights with President Trump took precedence over urgent work for the common good. At the same time, Madam President, we also hear from the very same Democratic colleagues they wish the Senate would spend less time on nominations. Well, the good news is that Senate Democrats can change that whenever they want. But as long as they continue to visit delays and obstruction on even these lower-level executive branch appointments, just for the sake of irritating the White House, the Senate will continue to do our job the hard way. Of course, in the weeks ahead, we'll also tackle significant legislation for our country. We will turn to legislation to strengthen the implementation of the Paycheck Protection Program for the workers and small businesses that are struggling to weather the storm. We'll consider a bipartisan bill from Senators Daines and Gardner to safeguard America's abundant public lands. And for the 60th consecutive year, we'll take up the National Defense Authorization Act to help guide the strategic and operational priorities of our nation's armed forces in the face of evolving threats. So make no mistake, the foreign actors who seek to harm the United States have not let up while we attend to other problems. For example, in Afghanistan, despite agreeing just months ago to engage in further peace negotiations with the Afghan government and sever its ties with al-Qaeda, the Taliban has instead continued its violent campaign against the Afghan people. President Trump has expressed frustration with the Taliban's failures and is reportedly considering withdrawing from Afghanistan even more rapidly. But as we weigh our options, we must not forget the painful lessons of the last administration's mistakes. Former President Obama and Vice President Biden were intent on beating a hasty retreat from Iraq, conditions on the ground notwithstanding. Just as many of us warned at the time, their recklessness left a vacuum that terrorists in Iran readily filled. ISIS flourished. Tragically, the rest is history. The resulting chaos threatened our interests and drew American efforts back into the region. By contrast, the Trump administration has seen a number of successes in this difficult region. The president's strategy has secured a territorial defeat of ISIS. It's put new pressure on Iran and given the Iraqi people a fighting chance, which their new government seems inclined to take. But helping Iraq stand up to Iranian influence will not be an overnight project. Iran wants to drive the United States from the region. China and Russia would also be thrilled with a reduction of American presence and influence there. So, Madam President, as we struggle to clean up the broken pieces of one rushed withdrawal, we need to avoid repeating those mistakes somewhere else. So I applaud the Trump administration for its approach thus far in Afghanistan. The President has taken constraints off U.S. forces. We've helped Afghan forces go after the terrorists. We've ratcheted up the cost on the Taliban, bolstered the Afghan forces that bear the brunt of the violence, and won additional international support for our mission there. And we've done all this with fewer resources and fewer personnel than during the previous two administrations. The President's strategy and diplomacy have helped create a path for discussion among Afghans, the only thing that can actually secure the country's future. If these qualified successes continue, it would be appropriate to further reduce our American presence as certain conditions are met. But we must retain enough forces and influence to maintain our counterterrorism capabilities. Given recent reports and our long-standing experience, we cannot just trust the Taliban will sever ties to al-Qaeda and other terrorist networks. We need to be vigilant. We need to maintain enough presence to judge whether the Taliban complies with agreements and help the Afghan government impose consequences if they do not. We need to maintain enough presence to preserve our strategic foothold against ISIS, the Haqqani network, and al-Qaeda. And we should maintain enough presence to help prevent a full replay of Iraq or Syria, a bloodbath, and a human rights collapse, particularly for generations of Afghan women. Last year, a bipartisan supermajority in the Senate voted for an amendment I authored which warned against precipitous withdrawal from Afghanistan and Syria in ways that could jeopardize the hard-won progress we've attained, embolden Iran and Russia, and create more pain for us and everyone else in the future. Our enemies would be thrilled if the United States grows too tired to continue the hard work of standing with partners, confronting our adversaries, and maintaining measured leadership that projects our security around the world. Our enemies would be delighted if we grow too weary to act in our own long-term interest. We must not give them that satisfaction.